The Titanic. I mean, the name alone brings up these huge images of luxury, of disaster. It's a story we all feel like we know, right? But what if the story we've been told is really just the tip of the iceberg? What if the truth is way more complicated and honestly, more human?
So let's start with this guy. This is Captain Edward John Smith. They called him the Millionaire's captain. He was an absolute legend in his time, the most experienced, most respected guy at the White Star Line. Basically, he was the person you trusted with your life and your money.
He famously went down with his ship, the very definition of a hero's death. But here's the question that's haunted his legacy. Was he a hero caught in an impossible situation, or was he a gambler who just pushed his luck one too many times?
You have to remember, back in 1912, the Titanic wasn't just some ship. It was the absolute pinnacle of technology. I'm talking incredible watertight doors that could seal off parts of the hull, a brand new wireless radio that could call for help from hundreds of miles away. People literally called it unsinkable.
And yet, in less than 3 hours, it was at the bottom of the Atlantic. Over 1,500 people were gone. The world was just in absolute shock, and everyone wanted to know how this could have possibly happened.
So the story that came out pretty quickly was one of arrogance, of hubris, and fatal human error. But, in the 100+ years since, we've learned so much more, and a much more complex, much more nuanced picture has started to form, one that really makes you rethink who or what was truly to blame.
So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive in, and we're going to frame this whole thing around a question that wasn't asked in 1912, but was asked right now on the internet.
And here it is. Is there anything that the crew did wrong by the standards of their day? That last part, that's the whole key. It's not about what you or I would do today with all our modern knowledge. It's about what was considered normal and professional for a sailor back in 1912.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's put the crew on trial, so to speak. And we've got to start with the biggest charge, the one that's been leveled at Captain Smith from day one, the ship's speed.
From our perspective today, this looks like an open and shut case of negligence. The ship's radio operators had received multiple warnings about icebergs right in their path, but they were still plowing ahead at 22 knots, which is nearly top speed. I mean, that's kind of like flying down the highway at 100 miles an hour at night, knowing there's a construction zone up ahead. It seems insane.
But this is where it gets really interesting. On the one hand, you have a ship nearby, the Californian, that actually stopped for the night because of the ice. That seems like the smart play, right? But on the other hand, you have the Titanic, a massive passenger liner with a tight schedule and a reputation to protect. And in 1912, the totally standard practice for a ship like that was to keep your speed up until you could actually see the ice. And this right here, this is the smoking gun. This isn't just some excuse made up after the fact. At the official inquiries, captain after captain after captain testified that what Captain Smith did was just standard operating procedure. You did not slow down for ice you couldn't see. You trusted your lookouts and you kept going. Full stop.
The devastating problem was, by the time the lookouts could see that mountain of ice, it was way too late. From the second the alarm bell rang to the moment of impact, the officers on the bridge had just 37 seconds. 37 seconds to turn a 46,000-ton ship. It was completely impossible.
Okay, so the decision to keep up their speed, while it seems totally reckless to us, was pretty normal for the time. But what about the evacuation? I mean, that's the other huge criticism, right? The image of all those half-empty lifeboats being lowered while people were still on the ship? The accusation is pretty damning. That the crew was just incompetent and disorganized, that they panicked, they launched the boats way under capacity, and that hundreds of people died because of it. But before we even talk about the chaos of the evacuation, you have to look at this chart, because this says it all. Even if every single lifeboat had been launched perfectly, filled to the absolute brim, there is only enough room for about half the people on board. The regulations were just so tragically out of date that a ship the size of the Titanic was never required to have enough lifeboats for everyone. It was a disaster waiting to happen before it even set sail. And the evacuation itself was just a perfect storm of problems. A lifeboat drill was actually scheduled for that very day, but it got canceled. Then you had the passengers, who'd been told for weeks the ship was unsinkable, and they just didn't want to leave this giant, warm, lit-up ship for a tiny boat in the freezing cold dark. Then you had conflicting orders, one officer yelling women and children only, while another on the other side of the ship was yelling women and children first. And get this, the crew was often trained to actually underload the boats because they were afraid the davits, the cranes, would buckle under the full weight. It was a total system failure, not just a few incompetent people.
So we've seen that the crew was pretty much following the rules of their day, and the evacuation was a heck of a lot more complicated than it seems. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the most important one of all: the role of just pure, awful, rotten luck.
What really doomed the Titanic wasn't just one thing. It was this incredible cascade of bad luck. The sea that night was freakishly calm and flat, which sounds nice, but it meant there were no waves breaking at the base of the iceberg, making it practically invisible. The sky was clear, but there was no moon, which made it even harder to spot something dark in the distance. The binoculars for the crow's nest? Yeah, they were locked in the cabinet, and the guy with the key had been transferred off the ship at the last minute. And in just the cruelest twist of fate, the iceberg they hit was the very first one in the entire ice field. They had zero warning they were sailing into a minefield.
And that really just sums it all up, doesn't it? It is so easy for us to sit here over 100 years later and play armchair captain. But we have hindsight. We know how the story ends. They didn't. They were just people doing their jobs in the middle of a freezing ocean in the dead of night, facing a situation that nobody had ever really prepared for.
So what's the big takeaway here? Is it just a sad story about mistakes and bad luck? Well, no. The thing is, the sinking of the Titanic wasn't just an ending. It was also, in a very powerful way, a beginning.
This disaster was a massive wake-up call for the entire world. The changes that came after were immediate and sweeping. The first ever International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, was held. It's still the most important treaty for maritime safety today. The International Ice Patrol was created to track icebergs in the North Atlantic, and they still do it. And maybe most importantly, it became law. Every single ship must carry enough lifeboats for every single person on board. No exceptions.
So in a very real way, the legacy of the Titanic is written into the safety code of every modern ship that sails today. The rules that we all just take for granted were bought and paid for on that one horrific night.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Was the crew of the Titanic at fault? Well, by the standards of their day, the answer is largely no. They were doing what they were trained to do, what was expected of them. The real, heartbreaking tragedy of the Titanic is that the standards themselves, the whole system, was broken, and it took the loss of 1,500 souls to finally fix it.
And that leaves us with one final, kind of unsettling question, doesn't it? What are the standard procedures of our time? The things we all do every day without even thinking about it, that future generations will look back on and see as shockingly, tragically reckless. It's something to think about.